Hello everyone, welcome to this class in mobile development, and we're going to be talking today about basic concepts of mobile dev. Pretty much those basic things that you have to start keeping in mind when you're going to start developing an app. So let's get to it. So there are four main considerations that you kind of have to keep in mind. The first one is the platform. What platform are you developing for? Are you developing for Android? Are you developing for iOS? Or are you developing for something else? So the next one would be the hardware. What sort of hardware your computer, your application is going to need? So the next one is your programming language. So your programming language will have to do with the programming language the platform is designed for, or whether you're comfortable with it or not. And finally, then the form factor of the mobile device. So let's take a look at them one by one in detail. So when it comes to the platform, the two main options will be Android and iOS, but there are other minor kind of competitors in there. So we have Windows Mobile, you have Ubuntu Touch, we have Selfish OS. So there are other options that are not necessarily iOS or Android. Of course, iOS and Android, they have the biggest chunk of the market, and 9 out of 10 times you're going to be developing for one of those two options. But that's something for you to keep in mind, that maybe for whatever reason you might be developing for another app, for another platform. Now, what about the hardware? The hardware is something that you also have to keep in mind, because your application might have some sort of hardware need or some sort of hardware requirement. I always give an example when it comes to the hardware, which is the Leapcart top-up app. So the top-up app uses the NFC chip in your phone to top up a Leap card, which is the public transport card in Ireland. So this application in particular is only available for Android and not for iOS. And you wonder, well, why? Well, the reason is because in iOS the use of the NFC chip is restricted, so it is not open to be used by third-party developers. On the other hand, because Android is open source and the hardware is there, so developers have the access to actually go to that hardware and make use of it. So in this case, in the Leapcart top-up app, you actually need to have access to that hardware, to the NFC chip, in order to develop the application. So it doesn't make sense to develop the app for iOS if you cannot have access to the NFC chip. So what about the language? Well, different platforms are defined for different programming languages. So for example, Android Studio is designed for you to develop using Java or Kotlin. So Kotlin being a variation of Java. So you pretty much have to know Java to do an Android application if you're going to use the native framework. However, using a hybrid framework would be done using web technologies or JavaScript, for example. So that's something that you kind of have to keep in mind. So different platforms will have different programming languages. And if you decide to go for one of those platforms, then you need to make sure that you are comfortable with the programming language that that platform is associated to. So the next thing that you have to keep in mind is the form factor. Now the form factor, I don't mean only the size of the screen, but I mean the all-in-all form factor of your device. So your device could be a phone, and within the realm of the phone, there are different screen size, but also there are different positions of the buttons, and there are some phones that they have a home button or not. So those are things that you kind of have to keep in mind. The same thing applies if you go, for example, developing for a tablet. If you're developing for a tablet, the form factor is completely different. And some devices might have a front-facing camera. Some devices might not. Some devices might have more pixels. Some devices might have a notch. So those different things are things that you have to keep in mind. Those are things that you actually have to consider when it comes to developing your app. Now, let's talk about frameworks. So once you have considered all these things and you say, okay, I'm going to develop an application that does this, and I'm going to do it for these particular targets. So you have a couple of approaches in here. The first option that you have is you can develop a native application. And the second option you have is that you can develop a hybrid web-based application. So let's go one at a time and see what that means. So when it comes to the native application, you pretty much are using the native framework for that particular platform. So in the case of Android, if you want to develop a native Android application, Android Studio is freely available. And that it is a tool that allows you to go to Android Studio. It allows you to create the application. It allows you to have access to all of the dance and whistles that Android has. And because it is its own platform, everything is just very well defined. They even offer some databases, and they offer templates. So there is plenty of support in there that you can actually access. Now, some of the pros of using a native application framework is that there is no intermediate layers in there. So you're talking directly to the, as we say in Spanish, to the owner of the circus. So you're going directly to the company. In this case, if you're developing using Android Studio, you're going to be actually dealing directly with Google. And that is amazing because there is a lot of support. And because they want you to use their frameworks, so there is a lot of actually support for developers. So no complexity overhead to conversion artifacts. And definitely the support is massive. So some of the cons, well, I'd say that the biggest cons that you would have when it comes to a native application, it would be that once you develop that application, it will only work for that particular platform. So if you develop an application for Android, then that is not going to be available for iOS, and that sometimes might be a problem. Now, if we go back to the Leapcar top-up app, it makes sense to develop that in Android Studio because it's not possible to do that application for iOS because you cannot access the NFC chip. But in the case of that particular app, using the native framework for the only platform that actually allows you to use that chip, well, you just go for it because the pros are much, much better than the cons. Actually, the cons is not relevant at all because we cannot run this application in iOS. So I'd say that that's the biggest drawback. But something else that you kind of have to keep in mind is the learning curve, because you're talking directly with these very complex systems. Sometimes the learning curve can be a little bit steep. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as well. Now, what about hybrid frameworks? So hybrid frameworks you're not really doing things directly with the company, with either Android Studio or Xcode, but what you're doing instead is you're creating a web application, and you're using actually web technologies. Now, what this does, it takes that web application and wraps it up in a sort of invisible web browser and allows you to run that application natively in iOS or Android, and it works seamlessly as if it was a native application. So the feels and the look is exactly as if it was a native application, but you're actually using a different framework. Now, this is where things get very, very interesting. Some of the pros of this is you're not dealing directly with these companies, so you can scale things back a little bit. So if you know some basic web development tools, then that would be enough to get an application up and running in no time. So all you need to know is a little bit of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. With that, you can actually create a decent application. You have no problem with compilation delays because most of the time the compilation and the deploying is happening in the cloud. So That really helps with that. There are different frameworks that you can choose from. So we were mentioning in the previous slide, you have you have PhoneGap, React Native, Ionic. There are plenty of options in there. So you can go with the one that you find more useful or the one that you find more user-friendly. So options are countless. So you can you can wrap up the application to run it as a native application, or you can run it in a web browser, and that makes everything a lot easier. Because if you can run and test your application on the web browser, then your process is a lot faster. And of course, you can access the application across multiple devices, across multiple platforms, and that gives you a big advantage. Now, what would be the disadvantage of this? Well, you're dealing with third parties. That makes a little bit of a problem. Sometimes the compilation process might take a little bit longer, and we're going to see that in the next class. And definitely, just the fact that you're using web applications, so those web applications you might be more prone to bugs and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where some of the problems would be. Now, I have that meme in there, and I always thought that was a little bit funny. The first time I was teaching this module, I was doing full-on Android Studio, and it was a nightmare. Not because Android Studio was bad, but because it was too heavy, and most of our computers, they just didn't cope with it correctly. So I always have that meme in there, and I always have this other meme in there, where you can see the heaviest objects in the universe. So we have the sun, a neutron star, a black hole, and Android Studio. So normally, most of our computers are, even if you have a decent computer with something like 8 gigs of RAM or 16 gigs of RAM, Android Studio still would struggle. I've noticed that Android Studio runs a lot better in Linux-based operating systems, so it works better in Linux and Mac than it works in Windows, unless you have Windows Pro. But all in all, I just think it's a little bit of a peg in the neck. So what we're going to do is we're going to be using React Native instead. And the reason we're going to be using React Native is, well, because it is going to give you a hybrid solution. So hopefully you should be able to deploy an application that you can run in either Android and iOS, but also the development process is a lot faster because we can do it through the web browser. So that is really going to be a big perk. Now, just a little bit of background on JavaScript. And the reason I'm going to talk about JavaScript is because React Native is based on JavaScript. So we need to be comfortable with that. So originally, JavaScript was created to add dynamic content to web pages. So remember, JavaScript is a client-side kind of programming language, so it runs in your web browser. So the way it worked is you have a server side that is running some sort of programming language as well, traditionally PHP, Java, or Python. And then on the client side, you have another set of code, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and that would run in your web browser. And then when the communications happens between them, happens through HTTP asynchronous requests or AJAX requests. So just to illustrate that point, because I know we've heard that many times. Just to illustrate that point, there are certain features, because remember, JavaScript is running in your web browser. There are certain features that they might or might not be supported by your web browser. So you can always have a look at a particular feature that JavaScript has, and you can see if the web browser actually supports it. So for example, we have the link that I have given you on the screen. So you can see that for this particular tool, which is WebP image format, you can see what's the level of support that that feature of JavaScript has. So for Internet Explorer, for Microsoft Edge, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, iOS Safari, and so on. So for any feature that JavaScript has, you can find whether some web browsers support that feature or not. And this is just to illustrate the fact that some of just to illustrate the fact that JavaScript is running in your web browser and not running in the server. The other thing that you can do, just to make sure you understand this, is you can go and open youtube.com and identify which part of the code of that web page is actually running on your browser and what part is running on the server side, and if there is any asynchronous link in there. So do that exercise and see if you open youtube.com, try to identify where is the code that is JavaScript code that is running in that particular web page that is not going to the server, and if there is any sort of code that is actually going to the server to get a response back. So that's something you can take a look. Now that we know that JavaScript is supposed to run in the front end or in the client side, then what's starting with Node.js? And this is the first time we introduce this code. We're going to have a class on Node.js. It's another video that we're going to see next. But Node.js is a way that we have to run JavaScript code on the server side. So now we don't have to have PHP, Python, or Java in the backend. We can also have JavaScript in the backend. So we can have JavaScript all across the board. And that's something that Node.js allows us to do. Now, how does it do it? So it happens that back in the day, Google, when they created Google Chrome, they created their own engine to run JavaScript code. Remember, JavaScript traditionally was running in the web browser. So Google said, okay, we need an engine to run JavaScript in our Chrome web browser, and they did. Because in Google they do a lot of things open source, so the Node.js initiative took the V8 engine that Google has developed for Google Chrome, and they wrap it up, and they use that to run JavaScript in any computer without the need of a web browser. So that's exactly what Node.js does. Node.js takes the V8 engine from Google and says, okay, now I can have any sort of JavaScript code and I can run it without the need of a web browser. So that allows us to bring that code into the backend, and now we can have JavaScript all across the board. Now, why do we do that? So why would be the need to have both languages, the same language in the front and the back end? Well, there is a couple of things. Number one, it helps you with one programming language on the full web stack. There are some capabilities for both object-oriented and scripting programming languages within JavaScript. So JavaScript is still quite a powerful programming language. It also helps with the consistency in object formats. So if you have a format for objects in the backend and the same format in the front end, so the consistency helps with the development process. And also, there are some sort of, that is the MERN stack that is quite popular, which is MongoDB in the database, Express in the backend engine, React in the front-end engine, and Node as the overall engine. And they work very well together. So when you have that stack, the whole JavaScript stack work very, very well together. So that's why Node was brought to the backend as well as the front end. So enough theory. The next thing would be, well, what do we need? So how can I start developing applications? So, well, we need Node.js. So you're going to go to node.org/ing, and with that, you can download Node.js and we will start getting applications very soon. The second thing we need is an editor. So you can use any editor that you like, any IDE that you like. If you want to use Notepad++, that's up to you. You probably are familiar with brackets as well, but my personal favorite is Visual Studio Code. So you can download Visual Studio Code and Node.js, and we'll be ready to go. So go for it, download it, and I'll see you in the next video.